the people who we admit to the role of a public intellectual are of a very limited kind. So it's almost as if we select a species of people for a particular role and exclude others. To give you a couple of examples, we normally think of intellectuals as people who are writers, men or women of letters, artists, cinematographers, whatever it might be. But there's a lot of people who we actually exclude or don't even think of as intellectuals, and that's not necessarily because we discriminate willingly, but because the available definitions of what intellectual life is, or what the intellect is, or what thinking is, or what thinkers look like, are very limited. For instance, we would never think of, let's say, skateboarders or rappers or graffiti writers or performance artists or breakdancers as people who are intellectuals. And that's because our notion of thinking and the intellect is one which almost exhausts itself in the head. It doesn't involve the senses, it doesn't involve the body, so we automatically exclude people who actually do express themselves in public, using their senses, using their bodies, and actually doing things that are very demonstrably public, compared to people who, let's say, sit on a chair, leaning on a desk, writing an article and addressing the public in a very sort of magisterial way. Now, in my view, I think it's more fitting to think of public intellectuals if what we're thinking is that embedded presence and that dialogue and participation that happens in public. It's much better to think of people who are actually doing those things in public rather than people who just address a public. Apart from this being, of course, a cultural bias, we do see that, sadly, even within the social sciences, and the way in which in the social sciences the figure of the public intellectual and the very definitions of public culture and intellectual life, what kind of definitions are available to us, and those are very, very limited. And I see a danger there, because it's almost as if we reproduce a particular cultural bias, if not producing it ourselves as social scientists. So I see something dangerous there, because it almost feels like a discriminatory practice, and it almost feels like we're not really exercising our scholarly imaginations to look further and to look to, as well as at, people who we might know very little about, or to subcultural groups that, again, we know very little about. And we simply limit our definition and understanding of what all of those things mean to a select few individuals that are always, pretty much mentioned, at the expense of, as I said, people who not only do we not think of as intellectuals, but we often think of them as marginal, and we often think of them as criminal too. So if one thinks of, let's say, 4 cellists walking into a park, that will in no way be seen as suspicious or dangerous. But if we do think of, let's say, 4 young black boys walking into a park with their smartphones and rhyming over a cheaply produced track on the phone, that will and very often does attract police attention. And I think part of the problem there, and although it might sound controversial, if not too far-fetched, is that actually what's being policed there is indeed definitions of what counts as culture, what counts as public order, what counts as nuisance, among other things. And of course race plays a big part in that particular example too. But I think there's a huge amount of suspicion in cultural terms, that one is undeniably culture and it's pleasant and it's not in any way disruptive, whereas the other is automatically dangerous, suspicious and actually antisocial. So the reason why I think it's absolutely important that we broaden the definition of what we mean by intellectual life and public culture is because we otherwise quite simply discriminate against forms of culture and people who we know actually very little about. So if we are social scientists, my whole argument is that we should know about people that we know very little about. Otherwise we just limit our research and we limit our thinking into what we already know. And I see very little value in that.